Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I want to welcome you all back. This is a show, of course, that gives you the libertarian perspective on the issues of the day. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to be back here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I thought we would revisit a case, an issue that we've talked about in the past. You've written a very interesting article that we've posted on our website today about trade wars. And so I thought we would revisit this issue of free trade, protectionism, trade wars. And let me give the general overall framework of the issue, and then I'll turn it over to you to describe what I think is a very interesting issue that you focused in on in your article that we posted this week on the website of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and that we shared with our readers of FFF Daily. In the ideal case, free trade involves the freedom of people to travel and trade wherever they want, that people of different nations or different political jurisdictions should be free to interact with each other, engage in mutually beneficial transactions, and try to improve their standard of living, pursue happiness by entering into trades with one another. Well, what oftentimes happens is that one nation or the government of one nation decides that it wants to, say, protect some domestic industry from foreign competition. And so they decide to raise tariffs or some type of import restrictions in order to benefit the local producer. And then what oftentimes happens is that the other nation says, well, now that you've started this trade war with us, we're going to have to retaliate against you. And we're going to retaliate against you by raising tariffs on your goods. But notice the collective pronoun that's always used here. It's we and us and our producers, and there's always this collective sense. But as you point out in this article, Richard, it's really not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. The title of the article is Trump's Economic Warfare Targets Innocent Bystanders. And I start off by reminding the readers that we often use the terms such as America versus China, America versus the European Union, America versus France, or whatever. And these are useful and convenient shorthands to get at what you want to say. But we need to remember that they are linguistic shorthands. When we say America and the European Union, what we're really talking about is multitudes of individuals, individual consumers, individual producers, in those two parts of the world, each of whom are distinct persons that have nothing to do with this amorphous concept of America and the European Union. Now, the other thing that I point out is that in military combat, in military warfare, even though obviously sometimes not even practiced in principle, but often theoretically stated in the modern era as an underlying premise, is that when two nations go to war with each other and they begin to target soldiers or supporting personnel of the opposite side, they declare that their belief that to the best of their ability, they should avoid hurting or hitting innocent bystanders. Now, we all know that even with precision weaponry, and to the extent that maybe combatants attempt to do that, innocent bystanders are inevitably impacted and affected. They lose their lives, they and their family members are perhaps permanently injured. But the idea is, under the modern rules of a humane order, is that the innocent civilian non-combatant is to be kept out of harm's way to the extent that it is militarily feasible. An ideal, if not always practiced. But that is totally different in economic warfare. And as I say in my article, if I can sort of lay it out quickly, suppose that in France, a special interest group goes to their government and then pressures the politicians in their government to go to the European Union bureaucracy in Brussels and gets them to pass legislation that imposes an import tariff against some American good. Now, immediately, particularly if you have a neo-mercantilist, protectionist-minded president, such as we currently have in the White House, the immediate attitude is we're going to retaliate. Well, if you raise your trade barriers against our goods, we're going to raise our trade barriers against yours. We will teach you a lesson. But again, if we disaggregate, if we decompose America, European Union, into its component elements of the individual consumers and producers, we see that it is totally different. And that, in fact, the perpetrator who has gone to his government to pressure to get a favor against his American competitor is not the target of the American retaliation. Unless that foreign producer, let's say in France, for instance, sells something in the United States that the American government can specifically target as retaliation against him, then how do you respond? Well, the U.S. government, for example, is doing this or has threatened to do this because of a trade war over beef. It seems that the European Union attempts to keep out American imports that are GMO, that is, enhanced and bred with artificial hormones. They say it's not healthy for people, it could cause cancer. In the World Trade Organization, where they have adjudicated this, the World Trade Organization said there's not sufficient scientific evidence to suggest that hormone-bred cattle cause cancer. But the point is that there has been a ban on hormone-bred cattle coming from the United States into the European Union for decades. It was adjudicated by the World Trade Organization. They seem to resolve it partly, but the American beef ranchers claim that there has been no reduction in the import restrictions. So now the Trump administration is saying, well, we're going to teach the Europeans a lesson not to treat America this way. So how are they going to teach let's say, the French beef ranchers, right, cattle ranchers, a lesson? Well, according to the Wall Street Journal article, which I referred to in my piece, the Trump administration intends to target Perrier mineral water. Okay, they're going to target scooters made in Italy and dirt bikes made in Stockholm and several other goods of this sort. Now the question is that what do these people have to do with some French special interest group in the cattle industry that have pressured their government and the European Union bureaucracy to harm, admittedly, an American exporter who hoped to have profits and market share by selling his beef to European consumers who would have presumably have been willing to buy them at a price they found attractive? Or why else would the French cattle ranchers have to petition their government and the EU bureaucracy to keep the American cattle out if European consumers did not want to buy it? So who are the innocent bystanders in this case? The European consumers, the people that Trump has said that he would retaliate against. And who will benefit from this? Will the American beef rancher benefit from this if this doesn't result in them lowering their trade barriers against the beef ranchers' exports to Europe? No. Who will it benefit? Well, those mineral water producers who produce in the United States, they will have less competition, for example, from Perrier. The dirt bike sellers and the scooter manufacturers in the United States, they will benefit from this. But who else will be hurt in this? The American consumers who like to drink Perrier, the American consumers who like to buy quality and obviously less expensive Italian scooters or Swedish dirt bikes. You have all of these networks of innocent bystanders in both the European Union and the United States itself in this attempt to retaliate. So all that you end up doing is consciously and intentionally aiming at innocent bystanders who have nothing to do with the conflict. And if I can just continue for about another minute or so, Jacob, I also point out in the article, imagine the following scenario, that you hear that there's some Frenchman named Peter who is bullying and beating up an American tourist in Paris named Paul. Now, shocked by this, you say to Peter, if you don't stop doing that nasty bullying and beating up, I'm going to have to intervene and teach you a lesson. Well, Peter keeps beating up poor innocent Paul, who's touring in Paris. So how is your response? Because Peter is in France. You're in the United States. Well, what you decide to do to teach Peter a lesson. There is a French tourist who's visiting New York City named Fred, and you start beating up Fred. And on top of that, there's an American whose name's Sam, who maybe knows Peter, but has nothing to do with the conflict between Peter and Paul, and you decide to beat up Sam too, because he's somehow connected with Peter. And then when you find out that Peter has not stopped beating up on Paul in spite of your retaliation against a Frenchman and an American, you say, you see what I've done? And if you don't stop beating up on poor Paul, I'm not going to only keep hitting Fred and Sam, I'm going to hit George as well. And that'll teach you a lesson. Well, what have these people got to do with whatever the dispute is between Peter and Paul? How is beating up Fred and George and Sam or anyone else going to anyway work on Fred from stopping his bullying and beating, particularly if he personally thinks that he gets some joy or advantage from beating up poor Paul? Now, it is true, the innocent bystanders can now honestly say to Paul, who's being beaten up in France, I feel your pain, because they're sharing in it as part of the retaliation. But the fact is, how has this assisted anything? How has that helped the innocent victim in Paris? Other than adding this wider network of innocent bystanders who are the victims of the retaliation. Now, if one understands the logic of that simple example, that's exactly what is threatened with this beef trade war that Trump is talking about, or all the other instances of teaching China a lesson in trade, teaching the rest of the European Union or other countries in trade, or Mexico in trade, or Canada in trade. The target of the U.S. government, or if they counter-retaliate, the Canadian government, the EU bureaucracy, whoever, will inevitably be innocent bystanders in the country being targeted, but who have nothing to do with the original dispute. And that is the danger, the hardship, and the immorality, in my view, of this type of retaliatory behavior. And besides, what else is one of the consequences? To the extent that you put up trade barriers, imports and exports fall in both countries. The market shares, the profits, the employment opportunities of those doing business and employed in those sectors of the economy pummeled. Some may lose their jobs. Goods become more expensive because the supplies of goods have diminished across borders, and presumably the qualities of the varieties will be less available as well. So all of those are the negative effects of fighting a trade war in which the target ends up being innocent bystanders.
All right, so you've hit on both the moral consequences of these trade wars and the retaliation that comes with trade wars, as well as some of the utilitarian aspects. Let's look at the fundamentals here, the basics. That is that why do people enter into trades with others? Why aren't they totally self-sufficient? Why not produce your own food and make your own clothes and make your own automobiles and so forth? Well, the reason is because we have division of labor. People specialize in what they like to do and what they're good at, and others do the same thing, and then they find that by doing that they can enter into trades with other people. Now, why do they enter into trades? Well, because they want to improve their own economic well-being, and you can do that simply through trading. I mean, you can have standards of living rise in a society with no factories at all, just through the act of exchange. Now, why is this? Because in every exchange, you're giving up something you value less for something you value more. So at the moment of the exchange, from your own perception, you have improved your standard of living. You've given up something you value less for something you value more. And that principle applies not only to trades with your next door neighbor, it applies to people in other parts of the country, it applies to people all over the world. When you enter into a trade with somebody from China, you have improved your standard of living. So now when government gets involved in this process, obviously it is interfering with people's pursuit of happiness through bettering their economic condition. When it imposes, let's say the Chinese government imposes a trade restriction, or we can go to your example about France imposes a restriction on the importation of American beef, that government is interfering with the French people's ability to buy whatever they want. If they choose to buy American beef, that means that they place a higher value on that beef than the money they're giving up to acquire that beef. So the corollary then to this principle of free trade is that whenever any government interferes with the ability of people to improve their standard of living through trade, it is actually interfering with people's pursuit of happiness. So when we have a trade war like this, you've got government interfering with this ability. So the question arises, Richard, what should government do then? I mean, let's say the French government imposes this restriction on the importation of American beef. Suppose the Chinese government imposes a restriction on the importation of Virginia wine. What should the U.S. government do in order to encourage or induce those trade restrictions which are interfering with the ability of people on both sides to improve their standard of living? What should government do then?
Well, part of the answer was given, and I, in fact, quote this fellow in the article. His name was MacLeod, Gunning MacLeod. He was a British economist in the late 19th century. And in a book of his, actually on the history of economics, which was published in 1894, he says at one point about economic trade retaliation, is that, in fact, he talks about France and Britain. He says, suppose that France smites us on the cheek. What is the retaliator's response? To hit himself on the other cheek even harder. Because the point is that, yes, a British exporter has been harmed by a French tariff, and it is a misfortune. But the only retaliation that the British government has is to limit the consumer choices of the British citizens, to make prices higher in Britain, limit the incomes that people could be earning and the better standards of living they could have by hitting themselves on the other cheek with counter retaliations. So what conclusion did MacLeod reach in his own analysis? Well, he goes on to say that the best way to fight protectionism is just to practice free trade. Do not impose similar counterproductive and harmful and unethical policies merely because your trading partner has done so. It just means that, yes, the American exporter will lose business. His profits will be reduced or maybe even lost in that market. But that just means that suppose that Frenchman just didn't want to buy that American or British good anymore. A change in demand, in preferences. Well, that American producer would still have to find an alternative niche for the investment of his capital and employment of workers. So even if it is artificial through a trade barrier as opposed to a change in consumer preferences, the American producer will just have to adjust. It's unfortunate that the market has been made artificially different than what a free market would be. But to retaliate merely exacerbates the problem with imposing burdens, hardships, and harm on your own citizens in the name of attempting to punish the misguided policies of another government.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind the rights argument here, the moral case. That is, when Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence that people are endowed with certain fundamental God-given natural rights, he's saying that no government has a legitimate authority to interfere with the exercise of these rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as part of this is the aspect of economic liberty. When you own something, including money, you have a right to do whatever you want with it. You have a right to use that money to buy whatever goods and services there are that are being offered around the world. So when the government retaliates with a protectionist trade barrier, what it's really doing is it's infringing on the rights of the American people to do what they want with their own money. Now, granted, if the French government does that, it's not a good thing for American, say, beef producers. It's interfering with the right of the French people to use their money the way they want. But that doesn't authorize the U.S. government to say, well, because they're destroying the rights of economic liberty and the fundamental rights of the people in France, this now authorizes the U.S. government to destroy the economic liberty and natural rights of the American people. It doesn't at all. So I would argue that it doesn't even have moral authority to retaliate because of this principle of fundamental rights. I would say the same thing, and I got this a lot from Frederick Bastiat, is that when another nation imposes some kind of tariff or import restriction, that we, the American people, should say, well, look, that's not a very wise thing to do, and it's a very immoral thing to do, to be interfering with the rights of your citizenry to do these things. But that's not going to alter our principled commitment to liberty. The American people here will still continue to be free now to travel and trade and interact. Now, granted, beef producers are still being harmed because they can't sell to France, but we're not going to destroy the rights of any of the American people, and hopefully the French people, through our example, by modeling, will come to their senses and ensure that their government drop that restriction.
Right. One analogy would be, suppose that an aggressor has shot someone in an act of violence, and now the government, in the form of the police, decide to respond, and they incautiously just start shooting indiscriminately, hoping to hit the suspected perpetrator, and in the process they hit a lot of innocent people, wounded or even killed. We would consider that absurd in the normal everyday affairs of police enforcement. Just like in the military, sometimes an innocent bystander gets killed. It should be avoided to the best of people's ability, but the ideal is that you're going after the suspected perpetrator who shot this innocent person, not using a scattergun, just hoping that you hit him, and in the process you hit a lot of people around the area or around him. Now, it would be immoral, because you'd be threatening to injure or kill people who have nothing to do with the perpetrator, and would violate their rights to their own life and liberty and health. So that's the logic of it. Yes, it's sometimes perpetrators do things, and sometimes a perpetrator can get away. That's a misfortune of an imperfect world with imperfect people. But it doesn't mean that because of that, you should then say, well, someone has to be punished. And I don't care who it is, as long as there's someone who's punished for the crime. And therefore, we're just going to see that someone is injured or killed to pay the price.
Yeah, I think a good example of the point that you make in your article is the embargo against Cuba. That here, the Castro regime instituted a communist state in Cuba, one that was totally independent of government control. It nationalized American businesses there. No libertarian would defend that. That kind of socialist principle, taking from the rich and appropriating it to the poor. But what does the U.S. government do? It retaliates by imposing import restrictions on Cuban sugar, which shoots American consumers in the foot, because they're acquiring sugar at relatively low prices, and suddenly now they have to pay a much higher price for sugar. Then you've got the entire embargo that prevents American businessmen from continuing to sell into Cuba. It seems to me, Richard, it's a classic example of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I can assure you that American sugar growers cried all the way to the bank in being freed from their Cuban competitors. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm earning these extra profits. It's for the national security of America. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gaining the extra business at higher prices. Give me a break. That's the real world of special interest politics. And you can be assured that when a decision had to be made, what is going to be embargoed in specific goods, not just in general, right, those covering terms. And a variety of special interest groups in the United States said, in the name of fighting communism, we're just going to have to keep out my competitor. Oh, how sad. I mean, let's face it, that's the reality of realpolitik.
Absolutely. Let's talk about managed trade and these trade agreements like NAFTA and the other ones that they negotiate. We libertarians have always opposed those types of agreements on principle. I mean, to the extent that they liberate trade, that they lower trade barriers, they're a good thing. I mean, that's what we libertarians are fighting for. But really, Richard, in order to achieve our ideal of trade, you don't have to negotiate anything. You don't need to enter into trade negotiations with other nations. All the U.S. government has to do, and what we say the U.S. government should do, is just unilaterally stop destroying the rights of the American people by lifting all trade barriers, ending all restrictions on the ability of people to trade freely with people around the world. Does that mean that other nations are going to follow suit automatically by lowering their trade restrictions? No, but it's the same principle as I was saying a few minutes ago with respect to France. And just because France has this trade restriction doesn't mean that the U.S. government should be retaliating. Well, by the same token, we have a myriad of trade restrictions in place right now. Tariffs, import restrictions, embargoes, sanctions. What we argue as libertarians is simply end those unilaterally without negotiating anything with anybody.
Right. I know that both you and I, over the years, have written about this and said, what should a free trade piece of legislation be about? And that it's not these hundreds of pages of agreements like the NAFTA agreement between, what domestic content do products have? How can the goods be transported across the border? What type of work conditions must be present in the places of employment where the products are produced, et cetera, et cetera. What we've just said, each in our own way over the years, is that it's very simple. The Congress passes a piece of legislation that says from day X, all restrictions, prohibitions, and limits on the free buying and selling of goods and services between the citizens of the United States and the rest of the world are abolished. End of story. It's 2 or 3 sentences, Jacob. And that's the end of it. In fact, it's worth recalling that while perhaps not as simplified as that, that's what the British did in the middle of the 19th century when they eliminated all of their agricultural trade barriers by one piece of legislation in 1846, and they did it unilaterally. And the position of the free trade movement, Richard Cobden, John Bright, the famous English free trade leaders, what was that the goal is to establish this freedom of trade for the British people. And all that they could hope is that the people of other nations would see the benefit of it and come to emulate the policies of Britain, not to try to impose it upon them or not try to retaliate until the other countries follow suit.
Yeah, and one of the fascinating parts of that free trade movement in Great Britain was that it was being led by poor people. The poorest people in society had seen the arguments that John Bright and Richard Cobden had been making, and they came to the realization protectionism, sanctions, embargoes, and so forth, they hurt consumers, and they especially hurt the poorest among the consumers. So I find it fascinating that among the people that were really fighting and successfully fighting to achieve free trade in Great Britain were the poorest people in society.
Yes, I like to sometimes point out, and I've mentioned it, I know when we just talked about this general thing before, is that during the campaign for free trade, particularly in agricultural goods, cheap food, there would be graffiti on the walls of buildings in London and other places, usually put up by little boys, saying, "I be protected and I be starved."
Well, and you pointed out to me a photograph many years ago where there was a group of people going through the streets in a protest for free trade, poor people, with a cannon, where there was a sign under the cannon that said "Free trade or this."
Yes, it was led by an English member of the British Parliament, an Irish member of the British Parliament, because Ireland, of course, was part of the British Empire at that time, and his name was Daniel O'Connell, from County Kerry, and in the southwest corner of Ireland. I've actually been to his home, very nice estate, and but he would lead these demonstrations through the streets of Ireland, in which the people would pull a cannon, and there would be this sign and saying "Free trade or this." Now, of course, they didn't mean it literally, but they were saying symbolically, you're harming us, and we're demanding to be lifted from our shoulders these restrictions that you've imposed on us.
Yes, and if you don't, this cannon's going to be fired at you. Let me wrap up by just simply pointing out the big free trade zone that we have here in the United States. We take it for granted, Richard.
Yes.
But really, it is the biggest free trade zone in history. And we've all grown up with it, so it's just commonplace. We take it for granted. But it really is a remarkable thing that people can cross state barriers freely without paying imports, tariffs, showing ID cards, and it's really one of the principal causes of American prosperity.
Yes, just imagine, as the Trump administration is now proposing with its extreme vetting for foreigners wishing to visit the United States, that every time that someone like yourself was leaving Virginia and wanted to go to Pennsylvania or Maryland or even further afar to California, you would have to submit documents giving your passwords for all of your social media sites and for your cell phone, so it could be checked out. And before you were allowed to enter Pennsylvania or Maryland or North Carolina, for instance, since you're in Virginia, you would also have to have an interrogation by a customs agent to determine what are your political views. Are you loyal to the principles by which the people of North Carolina live? I mean, this is the ludicrousness. Look here, there are bad people in the world. And whatever their motive, there are people who would like to come to the United States and do dastardly things. We've been seeing this in Europe and in the United States. And it is the duty, if you believe in limited government, of law enforcement to protect the life and property of innocent citizens. Absolutely. But this type of barriers at borders is basically the end of an international order of a cosmopolitan human race in which we trade with each other, in which we exchange ideas with each other, in which we can visit, travel, and do business with each other as one community of people attempting to better themselves through, in the broadest sense, global free trade and global freedom of visit, movement, and settlement. This is a dangerous direction that we're following. So thank you very much, President Trump, for taking us backwards hundreds of years. Yes,
yeah, you remind
America great.
You remind me of the two shooters that were crossing over from Maryland, assassinating people from Virginia several years ago, and they couldn't catch them. They were shooting people at random at service stations and so forth, and we were all living under this cloud of like, who's going to be next? But to the credit of the American people, they never once called for any restrictions on the border between Maryland and Virginia, even though they knew that whoever was doing this was crossing back and forth. They didn't have long lines at the bridge crossings, checking people's trunks and so forth. I mean, what Americans valued was their freedom, even though it was insecure. And if they could only apply that principle internationally, we'd have a much better world.
I totally agree. We should have a peace and freedom.
All right, Richard, on that note, I greatly enjoyed the show, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Next week. Thank you for watching and listening.